As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at an angle of pursuit and keeping up with the bus at 85 miles per hour. As the figure got closer, I saw that it was a humanoid form. As a matter of fact, it looked exactly like a human, only that the face was painted half black and half white with glowing eyes. Glowing eyes like a rabbit's eyes, reflecting light from a spotlight. My initial thought, it's a skinwalker. The skinwalker ran up to the edge of the road and just kept up pace with the bus, staring at me. After I made eye contact with the thing, I could not look away. It was as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. The skinwalker just smiled at me, this inhumane smile that went ear to ear, showing crooked, yellow pointed teeth. I felt like I was going to throw up, and I was panicking through the whole ordeal. The skinwalker started to crumple down onto all fours, still keeping up with the bus. I could see his bones crack and reform, hair starting to appear all over its body, and in about 3 seconds was now a coyote, and it ran off back into the desert out of view. As soon as it was gone, I ran to the onboard bathroom and puked a mixture of food and blood. I didn't want to tell anyone for fear that they would think I was crazy. I confided in my Navajo friend. She told me that I needed to see the chief, who also happened to be a friend of mine, and get a blessing. He just came up to me and mumbled something in Navajo while waving a feather scepter-like thing, turned around, got in his truck, and drove away. To this day, I haven't seen another skinwalker. It might be because I moved away from that town and rest, and if I do have to go south, I'll go around, way around. Anybody that has been on the Navajo reservation has either probably heard of some creepy things or have experienced pretty creepy things, namely skinwalkers. I have only seen one. Here's my story. I come from a small town in North Arizona that's sandwiched between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the U.S. largest Navajo reservation to the south. My high school being so small, a 1A high school that has, on average, 80 students enrolled every year, I always had to travel south about 5 to 10 hours one way to play another high school in any sport. This means that we travel a lot on the Navajo res, and we would also stay at hotels when we would head out to play and come home in the morning. But this trip was a little bit different. I remember the basketball coach saying that the school didn't have enough money to put up the teams in a hotel that trip, so we were going to be on the road for a total of about 12 hours. I was the only male senior to play basketball that season. We had just got done playing our game and headed home on our bus, Big Blue. We were headed out about 2 hours of driving before we had entered the res. By this time, everyone was asleep, with it being about 2 in the morning. When we had crossed the res's border, I noticed the bus driver had sped up and was now going about 85 miles per hour. I thought this was a little weird because he never exceeded the speed limit, at least not in my high school career. For some reason, I couldn't fall asleep like the rest of my teammates, and I just sat at the back of the bus, staring out across the desert landscape that was lit up by the full moon. As I looked out, I could see a figure running towards the bus at
I've worked at a graveyard for the past 15 years, and most of those years being the typical graveyard shift, which was from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. In my mind, working overnight had many more benefits than working during the day. Day workers had to do more because people would be visiting the yard and there would be burials taking place a few times a week that needed to be arranged. And above all else, night shift gets paid an extra $2 an hour. I've seen a lot during my years working night shift though. Mostly teens messing around, occasional drunk group of friends daring each other to walk through the graveyard. However, this night was different. I got to the small faculty building a bit early to chat with the day worker, and once he left, I did all of my normal checks and precautions at the beginning of my shift. Afterwards, my only job is just to really drive around in a golf cart every so often and just make sure there's nothing going on. I'd say I only encounter something once a month and maybe even every other month. Anyway, the first few hours were normal. I drove around several times, then went back to the small faculty building to eat my lunch. I think it was at around 2 a.m. when I went back out to do another round of the yard. As I got to the far end, I saw something by the fence. It was obviously really dark, so I couldn't really see much more than the general shape of a figure just standing there. I drove up closer and I could tell now that it was a man standing on the outside of the fence looking toward me. I didn't want to confront him if I didn't have to, so I turned around and drove in a small loop around the lot to see if he would try to hop the fence while I was gone, but when I got back after 30 seconds, he was gone. I scanned the area briefly to make sure he didn't sneak in, but it all looked clear, so I continued with my patrol. Going through the whole yard takes about 15 minutes, but sometimes I'd go slower just to pass the time. I went all the way around and decided to check back on the spot where I saw the man. I really didn't have anything better to do anyway. Started driving down there and almost immediately I spotted the man again. He was inside the yard, standing on the gravel path. I drove up closer again, but the man didn't move. I exited the golf cart and started walking up to him. He looked like a 40-year-old man. I stopped just a few feet away from him. "Sir, you can't be in here. I'm going to have to ask you to leave or escort you out," I said, but he didn't even turn his head to look at me. After a second, a slight rush of fear went through me. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." I reached my hand out and gently tapped him on the shoulder. As soon as I did, he whipped his head around to look at me. He just stared into my eyes. He looked so full of rage. I took my hand away and the man turned around and started walking away. I got back on my golf cart, preparing to call the police as I watched him go all the way down to the fence. He stepped over it and continued walking away. I was relieved, but still felt terrified. I drove back to the faculty building and went inside. It was a small single-room, security-type building, but I felt a lot safer and calmer inside. I sat down and I caught my breath. In all my years, I'd never really been scared because it was always just people messing around, but this was different. I waited inside for a while. I'm not sure how long until I heard a bang on the door. I jumped out of my chair and stared at the door in fear. A few seconds later, they banged on the door again. These were aggressive knocks, not those of someone being friendly. I had nowhere to go. I picked up the desk phone and called 911. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were here, but I certainly wasn't going to risk it all to find out. After about probably 3 minutes of them banging on the door, I heard them walk away. I still waited for the police to arrive before I opened the door. The following day, my manager was able to pull the CCTV security footage from the building, and what I saw was horrifying. Just minutes after I entered the building, the man I'd seen in the yard earlier walked up to the door. He stood there silently for nearly 15 minutes before he banged on the door. He was also holding something in his hand, but the footage wasn't detailed enough to make out the object. It was likely a small pipe or a bat of some sort. The man was never identified, but I still worked the same job at the graveyard, and I haven't seen him since.
It was my first Halloween living in my own house away from my parents. I live in a small corner house with a basement but no upstairs, a house my parents paid half for. It was 11 o'clock at night. I was sitting in the living room watching scary Halloween movies when I found myself getting up to answer a knock at the door. But then I stopped and thought, who could be at the door at 11 p.m.? Surely there were no more trick-or-treaters out. I had a pretty good feeling it was a late-night Halloween ding-dong ditcher, so I gave it a second, then I shot a glance to the porch through the window. They were gone already. Yup, ding-dong ditchers. I sat back down not thinking twice about it, and again, knocking at the front door. "Get lost," I yelled. I was not in the mood for punky kids. They ignored my demands and started pounding now, not just knocking. I was pissed now. I leaped up and swung the door open. No one was there once again. I slipped on my shoes and headed outside to begin searching the bushes for the kids, but there was nobody in sight. Not in the bushes, not behind my car, not across the street. I was done answering. I didn't want to feed into their fun anymore, so I went back inside, double-locked the door, and went to my bedroom, also locking that door, just to feel safer, I guess. Even over the TV, I could still hear the stupid kids pounding on my front door repeatedly. I was so close to calling the cops to get them away, but that would undoubtedly lead to my house being egged or teepeed. The pounding continued for an uncomfortably long time, more than half an hour. I thought these kids must be filming something for YouTube and were desperate for a reaction, but I wasn't going to give it to them. At some point I dozed off with the TV on, only to wake up to the knocking again. I looked at the clock. It was 2 in the fucking morning. How could those kids still be at it, I thought. I turned the TV off and sat up with my ears open. For a few moments, my heart completely stopped as I realized the knocking was not at my front door, but rather at my bedroom door. I jumped out of bed, looking around my room like a madman for something to use as a weapon. They knew I was awake now. They were trying the doorknob, trying to bust down the door. These weren't any kids. By some miracle, I came up with an idea. It was a long shot, but it was all I could think of. I turned on the receiver to my speaker system, plugged in my iPhone, brought up the YouTube app, typed in 45 gunshot sound effect, turned on the volume, and pressed play. The sound of a gunshot echoed out of the speakers. It sounded real enough. I paused the video after the first shot and yelled, "That was a warning shot. Leave now or I won't hesitate to shoot you in the head." And it worked. I heard 2 pairs of footsteps stomping over my wood floors and out the front door. I gave it a moment before opening my bedroom door and peeking outside. They were gone, but the front door was left wide open. I quickly shut it, called the police, and that's where my story ended.
For as long as I can remember, I've been freaked out by ghosts and demons. In the past, I've always told myself they didn't exist, but throughout my childhood, my grandmother was very insistent that they were real. She was an alcoholic, my grandmother, and a devout Catholic. Many times throughout the years, I heard her talking about how she saw things like demons and darkness around us. On quite a few occasions, when I would spend the night at her house, she would come into my room late at night while I was asleep and use an oil-laden finger to draw crosses on my head. Her version of protection, I suppose, but I still found it weird and creepy even at such a young age. And then, one day, she was gone. My grandmother died peacefully in her sleep, and my mom was left with the duty of packing and cleaning her mother's house. Me, being 6 or 7 years old at the time, was eager to tag along and help her. Not so much because I liked the work, but because I liked time with my mother. On one of the first few days after the funeral when we were at the house, my mom had mentioned that some other people might be stopping by to lend a hand with the monotonous list of chores that lay before her. We got to work, though admittedly I lost interest in boxes and cleanser a few minutes into the job, as most children do, and thought I would go explore the house. The other families that my mother spoke of had shown up a few minutes before, so everyone was busy scuttling around the house and lending a helping hand. I wandered around the downstairs, noticing that no one was paying much mind to me, and after searching every room, I went to the stairs and made my way to the second floor. My grandmother's house was not large by any means, but it also wasn't small. It was a typical mid-century colonial, nondescript and settled between 2 other houses just like it, on a quiet street lined with a similar array of brick and tapestry. It had a basement, which I'd never been in and frankly was never much interested in for obvious reasons. I felt the same about the attic, so my exploration pursuits were limited to the first and second floor. Arriving at the top step, I could still hear the bustle of bodies on the floor below, and the echoes of somber condolences as more help arrived through the front door. I rounded the corner and entered the hallway, where I was presented with 4 doors to choose from. I knew the door I wanted, however, and ignored the first 3 as I made my way to the end of the hall and entered my grandmother's room. I was immediately greeted with the smell of stale mothballs mixed with a pungent floral bouquet, the perfume my grandmother wore. Then I noticed a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old, sitting on the floor at the end of the bed. She sat cross-legged, picking at her nails. I remember thinking how pretty the pink flowers were on her yellow dress. I assumed she was the daughter of one of the families that had come to help my mother, and that she'd gotten bored with the cleaning quicker than I had and come up to escape and explore. I took a step toward her, and the floorboard beneath my foot creaked, which caused her to drop her hands into her lap and look up at me. She smiled. She stood and smoothed the wrinkles in her dress and looked up at me again, still smiling. "What's your name?" she said. I told her. "What's yours?" I asked. "Claire," she replied, and her smile widened. She then asked me if I'd like to play hide and seek. I had never been very good at hide and seek. Being an only child, I hadn't had much practice. But a game sounded fun in the midst of all the gloomy frowns and demeanors that had entered my world since my grandmother's passing. I agreed to the game and she nearly jumped for joy. Claire said she had wanted to be the seeker first, so she covered her eyes with her hands and dropped her head face down into the mattress and began counting. 1, 2, 3. I looked around, panicking. I wished silently that I was better at this and opted for the closet right next to the bed. I opened the door as carefully and quietly as I could and stepped inside. Then closed the door with the same amount of care, hoping Claire hadn't heard me. Once inside, I immediately became aware of the complete and total darkness around me. This was an old house, so the light switch for the light inside the closet was located on the outside of the door, not inside. I weighed my fear of the dark with my need to show Claire how good I was at this game, and decided that I would brave the dark and wait for her to find me. I could no longer hear her counting outside, so I assumed she must be wandering around looking for me. I drew my legs in and wrapped my arms around my knees. I guess as children we think that making ourselves smaller makes us more quiet. Funny now, but perfectly logical at the time. Minutes passed, and she still hadn't found me. By now, the darkness was starting to weigh down on me, and despite my best efforts, I was beginning to feel that lump of anxiety lodging itself in the back of my throat. I truly wanted to hold it together. I needed to. But after 10 minutes, I couldn't take it any longer. I had to get out. In a complete reversal of roles, I decided I would go and look for Claire, so I stood and felt my way to the door. It was only a step or two away, and after finding it, I slid my hand down the door jamb until I found the handle and turned it, far too excited to step out into the acrid scent of mothballs and stale flowers. But the door didn't open. It was locked. In the half second it took my brain to process the situation, I panicked. I began kicking and pounding at the door and jerking at the door handle violently. My voice erupted in wails of uncontrollable sobs drenched in horror as I screamed for my mother to come let me out. Then, my lungs began sucking air through gritted teeth, and even in the darkness my vision blurred. My legs grew weak beneath me and started to buckle. And then, the doorknob turned and the door slowly crept open. I fell to my knees in sudden relief and basked in the pale light of the room. I stayed there, slumped against the doorframe until the feeling returned to my legs, and then I stood and walked back into the bedroom, expecting to find the girl in the yellow dress. But there was no Claire, and the door leading to the hallway was now closed as well. Another surge of adrenaline coursed through my veins at the thought of that door being locked as well, but solace washed over me as I turned the doorknob, and the door swung inward without complaint. I took off through the doorway and sprinted down the hall. I rounded the corner and flew down the stairs, skipping every other step, and then proceeded through the front door and out into the yard. I found my mother there, talking to a neighbor. She was obviously upset about something, but when she saw me and the look on my face, she opened her arms and welcomed me. I told her about the closet and how it had locked. Then I told her about Claire and the game of hide and seek. She said she didn't know of anyone named Claire, or of any other children in the house. She said the group of people who were supposed to come and help had never showed that day, so the job of packing and cleaning the house was left for she and I alone. To this day, I have no idea who the families were that I saw in the house that day, or who the girl was in the yellow dress. The pink flowers were beautiful, though.
This is a true horrifying story, part 76. This story took place in Dubai very recently. There's a group of young Emirati guys that contributed money to rent a villa in a community in Dubai. They pretty much wanted to co-rent a house so they can spend time together on the weekends. So they rented this villa. They were playing games, partying,